So, hello and welcome. Mark Anderson here, Head of Education at NetSupport, and I'm really excited to bring you another great episode on NetSupport Radio today. Today, we're going to be looking at reading and the ways in which technology can engage, disengage readers. I'm really excited to invite Ian Turner from Reading Solutions UK onto the conversation today. I'll bring him in just a moment, but what's really interesting is they've just written a brand new white paper, which is titled How Educational Technology Can Transform Reading for Pleasure. Now, I found that a really great read. As you may well know, here at NetSupport, we are really invested in thinking about evidence-informed approaches to teaching and learning with technology. Sometimes that's not teaching and learning, sometimes that's about efficiencies and these sort of things. But certainly, when it comes to literacy and reading, this is definitely a firm, on the whole teaching and learning front. So if you do nothing else following this conversation today, please just go over to the Reading Solutions website, which we'll be sharing on the screen in just a few moments. But please do get yourself over there and check out that white paper. I found it personally really interesting, and I'll be certainly sharing it on my social media as well. Really, really interesting. But I don't want to sort of steal Reading Solutions' thunder on this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring on Ian Turner. So welcome to the NetSupport Radio, Ian Turner. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
No, you're very, very welcome indeed. And like I was sharing at the beginning there, Ian, I found that the white paper really, really interesting. Can you talk about your role within Reading Solutions and how you sort of came to be there and what your sort of background is in education first?
Yeah, so I mean, my background was 15 years in teaching on the front line. I suppose I was an English teacher, secondary trained. I was the head of department. I was the director of English for a multi-academy trust. I moved into senior leadership. I was a vice principal in a secondary environment. I became a deputy head in a middle school where I learnt a lot about the mechanics of reading, which I don't think is necessarily taught on a secondary basis in the training side of things. And it was moving away from frontline teaching. I set up my own publishing company to see how that would do as a little sideline, and ultimately that led me towards working with Reading Solutions UK, because a lot of their ethos, their philosophy, and the background of the people here was very much aligned with myself in terms of reading.
That sounds very much like my sort of route into how I've ended up working with NetSupport. To be fair, I'm a hugely. I think it's so important that we promote sort of strong digital citizenship with young people, and safeguarding is super important as well. And our products directly tie into those sort of approaches, and it's about making sure the technology works and so that you get impact on standards and all sorts of stuff that way. So lovely, there's some parity about our journeys into working with educational technology companies. Just diving, if I can, Ian, into the white paper for now. There are lots of great takeaways from it. One of the things that it focuses upon is reflecting on the impact of the pandemic. Now, I get to hear from lots of teachers from my conversations, speak to lots of students. I work with lots of students. I work with lots of schools around the world as well. And this idea of learning loss and lots of things that have had an impact on young people and teachers. We've all found it really hard. The workload for teachers during the pandemic has just been phenomenal. There's been lots of negative impacts, but out of adversity sometimes comes opportunity as well. So just reflecting back on the pandemic and the white paper itself, could you share some of the findings that are shared within the white paper about the impact of the pandemic on reading?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm coming at it from a perspective of my role with Reading Solutions, but also as the governor of a primary school and the father of a child who was in year 4 when the schools went into lockdown. Reading for pleasure is that key phrase that is used and that a lot of schools will use as a kind of a handle on their Twitter. But it's such a difficult thing to teach someone how to enjoy reading. And what really struck us is that as an online reading program, Reading Plus addresses silent reading fluency, stamina, comprehension, vocabulary, with access to a vast online library, that once the schools went into lockdown with very little notice, the libraries were closed, the books couldn't be changed between pupils. Suddenly there was a huge deficit in having the resources to give to young people to read. There were parents having to kind of take on that teacher role at home. There was the access to texts from home, whether they had just a small number of books or even books that were age appropriate and of interest to children. And I think what happened was that, as with lots of different areas, that schools became very, very adaptive and creative very, very quickly to address that issue. So what's come out of this in quite a big way is that those solutions they've been able to carry back into the classroom in terms of engaging not just children but their parents with the reading process, of looking at the mechanics of what makes you enjoy reading. How do you create that pleasurable culture and not just that quiet hour where you're seen to be reading? But also on top of that, it's the transferable skills of using a technology in an educational environment and transferring that to an actual physical book, or whole class reading. The technology doesn't replace what's happening; it enhances that side of things.
And I love that you're using that word enhance. A former colleague of mine, Zoe Elder, who wrote a fantastic book, Full on Learning. If you haven't read it, please do check it out. It's really good. But when we rolled out iPads back in 2011, we were doing the planning and training with teachers. The key phrase that we just kept reinforcing around the vision with it was that technology shouldn't dictate the learning, but enhance the learning. And so it's lovely that you're thinking in that kind of a way. It's not seeking to replace any of the other approaches to reading you might have, but actually sort of to supplement and sort of give a wider wrapper and to try and, like you say, improve a child's reading for pleasure.
Mm-hmm. And that was, when you look at there's lots of different solutions that are out there and lots of online reading resources that are available. But it's really looking at what you understand of your reading culture and the challenges inside your school. And I know myself from my own experience in the classroom that within a class of 30 children, you can have 10 years difference in terms of ability. And when you're dealing with something as invisible as silent reading fluency, it's very difficult to know what is happening when you can't hear or see the barriers that a child has. And they are key to unlocking that ability to read with any pleasure. If you find the process to be really laborious and awkward, if you visually navigate that text in a very uncoordinated way, you're not going to get pleasure from it. So the ability to use a technology that will make it easier for the teacher to differentiate, to understand and unlock other parts of the curriculum. I think whilst there will be gaps now that schools have returned, and there's catch up and all sorts of things that need to happen, I certainly do think there's been some positive things that we can bring back to the classroom. And also thinking about children who are kind of looked after children, or children who aren't attending schools, children in alternative provisions who didn't have access previously, that this kind of technological solution that's out there now will give them a much better deal in the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's such an important skill to have, isn't it? Literacy, is huge, and just thinking about the students I've had before working, even in the schools, just even having like functional literacy, which actually, if I remember rightly, requires you to score a grade higher than a passing grade at GCSEs, and sort of kind of functionally literate.
Yeah,
it's so important. What was really interesting, and I touched on this in the conversation. I'm going off piece from our script a bit here. Sorry. We were talking before. One thing that I found really interesting in a white paper was the sort of lexile levels in comparison from the language you'd find in a GCSE exam compared to what you'd have in a Key Stage 2 exam. Would you mind sharing some of those findings with the audience, please? I thought it was
of course.
Brilliant.
So the lexile range is that metametric measurement of the readability of a text. It's the international standard of knowing at what age range the complexity of that text is. Now, coming from myself, I found this fascinating from a secondary background to working in a middle school environment with year 5s and 6s, that when the 2019 SATs paper, when we looked at that in detail, there was a text, and a lot of primary middle school teachers will remember this text about the bumblebees had a Lexile range of a year 9 readability. So we're putting in front of 10, 11-year-olds a text that has the reading age of a year 9 in terms of complexity. And then added to that was the actual word count, was the highest word count that the SATs have ever seen, very close to the government target. And it was actually just 43 words shorter than the AQA paper 1, paper 2 combined word count for GCSE. So in terms of the expectations of children of the readability of the text, the complexity of it, but also the stamina to get through in a very short space of time, read something with confidence and understanding, and then demonstrate that understanding is a huge ask. And I think when people think about expected standard, they're thinking the expected standard of that age, and they're not factoring in the huge ask of the word count, of the understandability of the text that they're reading. So I think it's from a scientific point of view, it's a huge ask that we were probably unaware of.
No, massively so. And it's as an educator, it shocked me, both not just as an educator, as a parent. Like you, I've got a child in year 6 right now, another in year 8, both in the middle school, and I find it fascinating. Sort of linking that through to reading solutions as a tool to support reading young people. One of the things that the report focuses on, and this is I read about this sort of thing lots in books like by Dov Glimov, like Practice Perfect and Teach Like a Champion, as I'm sure you've had those on your bookshelf before. But it's this idea of the importance of automaticity. How can reading solutions support that, and what were your findings in the report around that as well?
So a couple of the key things around reading solutions is to do with it's the mechanics of reading, and it's the choice of texts. It's to do with rewarding children for reading and motivating them to want to read more. Automaticity is really linked with the ability to read something and to recognize at speed the meaning of a word within the context of the sentence, and not to become fixated on decoding that word. We know that just having encountering vocabulary that you're not familiar with can slow down the fluency of something, and we deal very much with comprehension-based fluency. So it's to do with being able to read with stamina and understanding and speed. It's not to do with reading quickly. You could read at 2,000 words per minute and understand very little of what you've read. But if you don't have the efficient eye movement routines, because reading it's a taught skill in terms of the actual physical movements of the eye. You've got six muscles in your eyes that need to be working in collaboration to move from left to right across the text. So the automaticity is being able to very quickly recognize that word and move on without becoming fixated on it. The same with vocabulary. If you see a word very briefly, to understand it, but to understand that depending on the context of the sentence, and a very subtle change in the prefix or the suffix is going to change the entire meaning of that. So certainly practice and exposure to vocabulary that you don't come across in your day-to-day talk is really important. So we were talking to a school last week where they'd been looking at a text with a thatched roof. And, unless you live in a cottage with a thatched roof, what on earth does that mean? So it's about having the provision of access to those words, but we very much deal with what we do is, for the most part, specifically commission the text to be written for us so that we can control the appropriateness, but also the level of the text. So that if you have, for example, a year 6, a year 7 child who's got the reading age of a year 2, they're given texts that are of interest to an 11, 12-year-old. They're not reading stories about a dog that chased a cat and saw a ball. They're stories that are interesting for them, but are readable for their level. So it's to do with a very, very scaffolded approach to providing texts that are high interest, but readable, whilst developing the actual mechanics of reading from left to right and taking in meaning at speed.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Ian. say that the white paper's got so much information in there, but I mean, the elephant in the room for many educators is often about assessment and accountability, which obviously then links into pupil attainment. Can you talk about how that sort of feeds into what you've shared in the white paper, please?
Yes, I mean, obviously we've not had the kind of the official assessment outcome expectations recently, but we could see that prior to the pandemic, that the demand was accelerating and ramping up. One of the key things for us as a company is that to be able to provide you with a tool that gives you greater assessment outcomes is fantastic, but it's that lifelong love of reading that you get from being able to read better or more efficiently. That's the big picture that we're working towards. And it's not just about providing young people with the resource to read. If I've used this analogy lots of times before, but if you give somebody a paintbrush and said, now you can paint for pleasure, you have the resource to paint for pleasure. It's not teaching them how to paint or how to enjoy that process. So just giving them the resource isn't enough. It needs to be something that directly instructs and that explicitly models and scaffolds and intervenes and adapts to what they need to do. So what we're looking at, particularly with Reading Plus and Reading Solutions, is something that is questioning at a very deep level which skills, which anchor skills are they secure with that they need to develop, what interventions would best suit each child at each level, and then providing them with the steps that they need to take in order to make those improvements. So I don't know if that answers the question or whether I've gone off on a bit of a bit of a side ramble there.
Not necessarily, Ian. I mean, I love the analogy of the paintbrush. I mean, I work a lot with schools, supporting them around technology and giving a teacher an iPad or a Surface or whatever. Lovely things to have, but it doesn't make you a master user straight away. And like you said, providing opportunities for practice, training, learning how to use it, reflecting, refining, all those different things are so important. So I massively agree with the analogy, and I can see how it links directly into this. How does Reading Solutions, you talked about how it can sort of provide opportunities for reading at the right level and all these sort of things. How does, apart from obviously providing texts, what else is happening behind the scenes to make the sort of the magic work? There's that quote, isn't there? When Arthur C. Clarke said, "When technology is sufficiently advanced enough, it's indistinguishable from magic." So what's the magic that teachers don't need to know about? But what is the magic that happens behind the scenes to support all these things that you're sharing in Reading Solutions and Reading Plus?
There's decades of foundational research that's gone in to the program. Mm-hmm. So a lot of us within the company have come from an EdTech or a teaching background. But even before that, we are the reseller of Reading Plus in the UK. And we've just recently been selling into a school in Dubai as well. The program originally started in America with optometrists in the 1920s who were looking at efficient left to right eye movement for decoding and reading and fluency. And it's developed over time with what would have been groundbreaking technology in the 1950s for being able to measure left to right eye scanning, which led to, in the 1980s, the first kind of computer-based program that could do that, and then web-based, the evolution that we're now using here. So there is a lot of magic or a lot of science behind the curtains of what's making the magic happen. What's really, really important is that the children are engaged with the text, that they enjoy reading the text, and that they feel motivated and rewarded. So partly what we do is to give them ownership of the program. So on their dashboard, it's very much written in their visual language. So if they do play things like Roblox and computer-based things, they get to decorate their dashboard and choose an avatar. There's an intrinsic motivation and reward system built in to unlock more avatars. They're finding out on a question-by-question basis whether they've got a full credit or a partial credit, how many words they've read, how quickly they were reading, what they need to do next. It's working with a kind of a Netflix type recommendation of, if you enjoyed this text, then you might enjoy this text, to build in a broader reading habit. So it's really, really adapting to their needs whilst providing the schools with really actionable data. So when I was talking before about just providing a resource and then measuring, what your reading age is, that isn't as robust as looking at a reading proficiency, which is factoring in comprehension level, vocabulary level, the reading fluency speed in there as well, whilst providing teachers with the understanding of, is it to do with inference? Is it to do with text structure? Is it to do with identifying explicit details? And at what level can or can't they do that? So it's very much a holistic program that the children enjoy and are developing through use of, but providing staff with the knowledge of where those gaps are.
That sounds really compelling on a number of levels, with my sort of teacher hat on, having a dashboard which brings all that data through into one nice place and space to enable me to track and monitor, and support every child. You mentioned this idea of varying sort of degrees of reading ages earlier in the conversation, but just like you'll know yourself, every classroom has that bell curve, doesn't it? And the same is true when you're working with colleagues as well, actually. You also have a wide range of experiences and confidences and all those things. So having a dashboard in there which brings those things through best suits teachers to be able to sort of know where children are at within their class. Tell me, in the dashboard, is it one which is sort of overarching? If you think about the sort of school hierarchy, so we'd have in a middle school, for example, we'll have like a head of English, and then we'll have like the other teachers across the school. Do the teachers themselves, do the class teachers themselves have their own sort of dashboard for their class, or do they have a dashboard for, or is it the sort of the head of English or head of literacy, would sort of feed that data down? How does that sort of work?
It's very much dependent on what the school needs. So the pupil has their own dashboard. For the teaching staff, they can have it from a class level, a group level. They can have it from an administrator level. So whatever level of access they need to be looking at, we can provide. And the important thing is that we provide them with complete support and training throughout the life of the licenses. So it's not something that we sell the program and off you go, best of luck. If you want some more training, that's £1,000. We want the children to get the most from the program, and so we need to make sure that the staff can get the most from the program. So part of the whole consultancy process is ongoing in terms of what level of understanding do you need? Have you got more staff who need training up? We're looking constantly at the progress of the schools and offering support and advice in a way that's collaborative and a partnership with the schools. We see ourselves very much as aligning with schools to make a difference rather than make money because we've sold you a program to use.
And that, I mean, as educators ourselves, we recognise and know the importance of relationships. With our teacher hat on for a second, we know from Hattie and others, that if we don't have that collective teacher efficacy plus that sort of relationship between the school, teacher, and child and home, and we haven't got that sort of triangulation of care around it, it's not going to happen. So why wouldn't you want to have that sort of same sort of setup with your, with the relationships you have with schools? Because you're going to get far more better feedback. For something that we do an awful lot here at NetSupport is co-create and make developments to our product based upon feedback from our schools. Why wouldn't you want to have those sort of conversations? That's really, really great to hear and massively resonates with me, Ian. Can I just ask, a secondary teacher by trade, worked in a middle school. What sort of age ranges does Reading Solutions UK support? I mean, often with these sorts of products, we hear of sort of Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, but I'm guessing with your background, it goes bit higher?
Yeah, so absolutely, the readability of the text that they'll have access to in the online library range in complexity from year 2 up to beyond Key Stage 5 and further education. So we do have a handful of children every year who complete the program, who are now able to read with the fluency, stammer and comprehension of somebody in their first year at university, at which point, somebody else needs to be able to do something.
My job is done.
for that particular 7-year-old. But it's from the stage where young people have the basic foundational phonics skills in place, that they're able, that they've just got through the learning to read stage. If they're at the reading to learn stage, if they can read text with the complexity of year 2 upwards, then there's plenty of opportunity in the program for them, particularly your more able readers in terms of enrichment, but also the fact that you may have very, very able young people who are able to read a text that has the complexity of 5, 6, 7 years above their actual chronological age, but their reading efficiency might be something that's quite weak. They might be reading with the speed of somebody in year 3, but they're reading with the understanding of a sixth former. At which point, how do you develop that fluency and that stamina so that they're not sitting in assessment conditions feeling anxious and frustrated and scared because they're never going to reach those high mark questions? And the other risk is that those children probably don't enjoy reading because the process is physically difficult for them.
Yeah. Ian, I wanted to jump in and just sort of jump back to something you mentioned earlier about engagement. I love the sort of the gamified sort of gamification type features you mentioned earlier. Things like being able to change your avatar and unlocking through reading access to more avatars. We see this in products in mathematics, for example. Things on Timetable Rockstars employ similar approaches. And to great success. Are there any other sort of gamified features inside reading solutions that sort of helps develop that engagement more with young people, those reluctant readers?
I suppose that the language itself has a gaming element to it, that the children, in order to make progress, they need to collect combos. So a combo we would class as 2 texts in a row that have been read with 80% or higher comprehension. For us, that's a measurement of consistent good understanding at the speed at which they're reading. For them, they've earned a combo and they're one step closer to unlocking the next level of texts. That next level of text is actually a year more complex in the way that those texts are structured and the vocabulary that's used. So over time, without being particularly conscious of it, they're reading texts that are more difficult and they're reading them more quickly and with a greater understanding. And that's through using that competitive element of the combos and unlocking the avatars. And from a teaching perspective, there's a leaderboard which is tracking their progress from each child's starting point. So if you're looking at who has leveled up the most, who's increased their reading speed by the most, who's got the best winning streak for the number of texts read in a row without dropping beneath 80%, it's not necessarily the most able who are the top of that league, because you're tracking from your own starting point. So everyone has the opportunity based on their effort and their engagement with the task.
Oh, thanks, Ian. And that's so important, I think. I see some low-stakes quizzing tools, which, frankly, aren't really that low stakes when the students are like, ah! But, with those sort of things, you often find it's very often the same sort of, 5 to 10 students who feature in that little leaderboard just by getting answers correct. And how motivating is that for those 20 other students who just never, ever get to go on that leaderboard? That's so lovely to hear that you're doing it based upon their starting points. I think that's so, so important, because every child needs to have that opportunity to succeed, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant stuff. Well, look, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think we could talk about things around education and reading for much longer than we've got available today. Before we wrap things up, though, Ian, was there anything else that you wanted to share before we end the conversation today?
Really, if we are, as I think I've mentioned before, besides the program, we're doing so much more in terms of writing the white papers. We do research. We're putting on conferences, reading conferences, sharing best practice. So please do come have a look at the website, have a look at Reading Plus, have a look at Reading Solutions UK. You can find us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We've got lots of activity. We want to work in partnership and learn from schools as well. So please, it's all about working together and collaborating for making a real difference. So looking forward to working with more people.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Ian. So if you didn't catch it, it's going across the screen at the bottom, and I managed to point in the right direction for a change. Please do go to readingsolutionsuk.co.uk, or you can follow them on Twitter at Read Solutions UK as well. And as someone who's been, prior to this conversation, checking out the social media account, as you probably would do yourself, there's lots of engagement in there. It's not just a dead account, not managed or tracked by anybody. So if you're looking to find out more, please do get in touch. And these offers of training and support around the conversation as well, and I think that's really key to having that wider impact beyond just the selling of the product and developing those relationships and all those things we mentioned before. So thank you for taking the time to join me today, Ian, on NetSupport Radio. Really enjoyed the conversation. And please do remember to subscribe, hit the like button, all those things besides. And if you're listening on NetSupport Radio through our podcast, then thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, then why don't you go and bookmark youtube.com/netsupport, and then you'll never miss any episode of any of the things that we provide out of our social media. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you to Ian as well for coming and sharing about reading. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye.